The movie begins with a scene set in 1899 at Oxford University, where a lecture is taking place. The focus is on a professor who is demonstrating a case of female hysteria involving a beautiful woman named Eliza Graves in front of his class, which includes a young man. Despite the patient's protests about her sanity, the professor argues that all mental patients claim to be sane. He proceeds to touch Eliza inappropriately to trigger her hysteria, as she strongly dislikes being touched, which consistently leads to her experiencing hysteria. After the demonstration, the professor instructs his assistant to bring the next patient. The scene transitions, and we are introduced to a man named Edward Newgate, who is making his way to the Stonehurst Asylum. Edward happens to be a doctor, and Mickey, the head of the guards, greets and accompanies him, showing him around the area. It becomes apparent that the asylum houses over 200 patients, many of whom come from prominent British families, including lords and ladies. Edward explains that he has been sent to the asylum to gain practical knowledge. It is worth noting that he arrives on Christmas Eve. The affairs of the asylum are overseen by Dr. Silas Lamb, the superintendent, who introduces himself to Edward. Edward informs him of his intention to work with mentally ill patients, impressing the supervisor, who welcomes him to join the rounds in the afternoon. During his introduction to the patients, Edward encounters Eliza Graves once again, the same woman from the beginning of the movie. Her condition piques Edward's interest. It is revealed that she hails from a noble family, and her husband is one of the wealthiest men in Britain. Eliza has been sent to the asylum for treatment due to her recurring hysteria, which is triggered even by a simple touch. She bit her husband's ear when he attempted to touch her, prompting her father to have her admitted. Despite her condition, Eliza possesses remarkable musical talent and captivates Edward with her abilities. Additionally, she is physically attractive. They discuss the treatment of patients in the asylum, and Edward is surprised by Lamb's unorthodox methods. Lamb disapproves of medicating or confining patients and instead encourages their delusions if he believes it will bring them happiness. He does not actively work to improve their conditions, opting to keep them comfortable as they are, which Edward finds concerning. Edward is then invited by the Lambs to join them for dinner. He proceeds to the dining area and is taken aback when he realizes that the patients are also seated at the dinner table. Confused, Edward questions Dr. Lamb about this, who explains that it is beneficial for the patients to interact with polite society. Despite the initial shock, the dinner proceeds smoothly. However, the atmosphere becomes tense when Edward directs a comment towards a man named Mickey Finn, humorously remarking on his name. The room falls silent, and an awkward tension lingers. Unexpectedly, Mickey breaks the silence by laughing out loud, diffusing the awkwardness. Shortly after, Mickey pours wine for Edward, but as Edward is about to drink it, Eliza observes his glass closely. She discreetly kicks him under the table, causing him to spill wine on his shirt. Surprised, Edward is about to speak, but Eliza urges him to leave with her so she can clean his shirt. Agreeing to her suggestion, they step out of the room. Once alone, Eliza insists that Edward should leave the place as soon as possible. Edward is bewildered by her abrupt request and asks her for an explanation, but she avoids giving a direct answer. Later that night, Edward retreats to his room and retrieves his gun, keeping it ready in case of trouble. Suddenly, he hears a loud thud, followed by raucous noises. Using his torchlight, he investigates the source of the commotion and discovers imprisoned individuals who implore him to help them. Initially assuming they are mad or violent patients, Edward eventually realizes that the ones he is conversing with are Lamb and Finn, who orchestrated a revolt by drugging the staff and imprisoning them. The patients have taken control of the asylum. Among the captives, Edward encounters the real superintendent, Dr. Benjamin Salt. Additionally, 2 nurses and several other staff members, including a health guide, are also held captive. They explain that they unwittingly consumed drugged drinks and were subsequently confined in the basement. Edward comprehends that if he had drunk the wine offered by Finn earlier, he would have suffered the same fate as the other staff members. He now realizes that Eliza may have saved his life. Without delay, he rushes to find Eliza and shares his newfound knowledge. However, to his surprise, Eliza is already aware of the situation. She confesses that she assisted Lamb in locking up the asylum staff. Intrigued, Edward decides to play along. The following morning, Lamb, accompanied by Mickey Finn, conducts rounds, and Edward is asked to join them. Lamb takes them to a violently disturbed patient and instructs Edward to change his attire. As Edward approaches the aggressive individual, he is immediately attacked and pinned against the wall. The assailant attempts to choke Edward, but in his struggle, Edward notices the name Arthur written on the wall. Uttering the man's name unexpectedly calms him down. While Lamb is impressed by Edward's quick thinking, Edward is unhappy due to his injuries sustained during the assault. He departs, and later Eliza joins him to tend to his wounds. During their conversation, Edward reveals his plan to free all the prisoners. However, Eliza expresses her discontent with this idea. She informs him that when the original staff worked at the asylum, it was a living hell for the patients. Eliza discloses the sinister truth about Dr. Salt, revealing him to be a monstrous individual who conducted cruel experiments on the patients. Some of these experiments were particularly brutal. Eliza herself fell victim to Salt's inappropriate touches, disguised as attempts to find a cure. She believes that he used her as an experimental subject, treating her like an animal. Eliza describes the horrific torture of patients being subjected to high-pressure running water for days on end. Salt's theory is based on discovering the patient's worst fears to cure them, which he uses as justification for his torture methods. It is revealed that Lamb, the one who suffered the most, remains a mystery to Salt, as his worst fear has not been discovered. When the patients could no longer endure the torment, they meticulously planned for months, drugged the staff, and imprisoned them. Lamb assumed control, and since then, the patients have been granted freedom to roam. Eliza discloses that Lamb assigned various tasks to the patients, essentially allowing them to manage the asylum themselves. They will be able to escape without resistance. Edward finds a picture in Lamb's room and realizes its significance. While everyone else is out celebrating, Edward stays behind and discreetly drugs all the wine, ensuring that anyone who drinks it will become unconscious. This will provide an opportunity for their escape. Finn reappears once again and exposes Edward's actions to everyone. Lamb approaches Edward and strikes him with a bottle, causing him to lose consciousness. When Edward regains consciousness, he discovers that he is tied to a stretcher and being taken to the electrotherapy room. Just as Edward is about to be subjected to electrocution, Eliza arrives. She discovers her picture in Edward's pocket watch and suspects that he was sent by her husband to retrieve her from the asylum. Eliza confronts Edward, demanding to know the true reason for his presence in the asylum. Edward reveals that he attended a lecture 6 months ago at Oxford University, where Eliza was a subject of demonstration by a doctor. He was one of the students present that day, and he made a decision to help Eliza escape from Stonehurst Asylum. Edward assures Eliza that this was his sole motive for coming to the asylum and urges her to leave before he is taken to the therapy room. Just as Edward is about to be electrocuted, he makes a final request to Lamb. He asks Lamb to look at a picture of Eliza that Edward keeps in his pocket. When Lamb sees the picture and realizes it is one of his victims, the shock causes him to stagger out of the room. It is then revealed that Lamb was once a legitimate doctor who, overcome by guilt after fatally shooting soldiers with severe wounds, attempted to end his own life but ran out of bullets. This incident led to his descent into madness. Finn tries to take control of the situation, but Eliza intervenes, and a fight ensues between Finn and Eliza. Finn triggers Eliza's hysteria, but Edward manages to calm her down. Finn ultimately gets electrocuted and perishes in the process. The others, tired of the violent behavior displayed by Lamb and Finn, align themselves with Edward and Eliza. Edward sets out to find Lamb while Eliza goes to free the prisoners. Edward locates Lamb in the hallway, where he is losing his sanity. Edward takes him outside, where the other patients are gathered. All of them are now safe, as the prisoners have been freed. Edward expresses his desire for Eliza to be with him, but she refuses, citing their differences in normalcy. However, Edward insists that he is not normal because he is in love with her and has a secret to share. The scene transitions to a few months later. Eliza's husband and the former Oxford professor arrive and are greeted by Tim, who has now become the new gatekeeper. The professor requests Eliza's release, but nurse Mrs. Pike informs them that Edward has already released her. To their surprise, the Oxford professor reveals that he is actually Dr. Edward Newgate, and the man they believe to be Edward is an escaped mental patient with pseudologia fantastica. It becomes evident that the imposter Edward is the same young man who was presented in front of the class during Eliza's demonstration. The movie concludes with Edward and Eliza, now known as Dr. and Mrs. Lamb, living in Tuscany, Italy. They are shown dancing and embracing in a garden, implying that they have found happiness together. It is revealed that they are in another asylum, but this one is run peacefully by nuns.